My name is Stefan Liebig and I'm the director of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in New York. I am delighted to have with me two great scholars, Jasmine Owens and John Feffer. I will introduce them in a moment. But first I want to thank Ploughshares for hosting us this morning, and let me start by turning the floor over to Emma Belcher.
I'm sure I won't say your name correctly.
I have a CH in my name too, and Americans always struggling with it.
Hey, how did it?
I am a Liebig.
Oh, Liebig.
And that's always a Liebig or something.
So I'm sorry. I would like to say my last name is Ploughshares. I think that sounds quite good.
Yeah.
I think it sounds better than Belcher. Yeah, something a bit more French and less potentially rude. In any case, thank you so much, Stefan. Am I saying okay? Great. Welcome to you and to Mariana, and thank you to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for co-hosting this event with us. For those of you who don't know, I'm Emma Belcher, president of Ploughshares. We're the largest foundation in the United States singly focused on nuclear weapons reduction and elimination. So I think it's very fitting that we're co-hosting today. Obviously, the Atlas of Disarmament is about more than just nuclear weapons. It's so many issues and other kinds of forms of tools of war. But we're really glad to see that nuclear weapons are in here as well. Having a look, it's just so comprehensive and impressive, and the amount of expertise you've brought together and poured into this is remarkable. So I'm looking forward to having more of a look, and we'll be delighted to hear about how the conversation goes today. Unfortunately, I'm not able to stay, but I did want to say welcome to the Ploughshares space. We're always glad to be able to host people when there are opportunities. So please, you have a standing invitation, as do the rest of you, to share in our space and join with us as we do all of this critically important work together. Yes.
Thank you, Emma, so much. And actually, we are partners in the fight to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. Next year, we will have a lot of anniversaries, and one anniversary will be the 80th anniversary of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and this will be one of our main topics. And wouldn't it be a nice year to finally come to a ban of these terrible weapons? This is also Jasmine Owens' issue. She is a nuclear weapons abolitionist, writer, educator, and organizer. She has a master's in non-proliferation and terrorism studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and has worked with the Outrider Foundation, the Council on Strategic Risks, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and Rethink Media. Thank you for coming and being with us. Let me also introduce John Feffer. John Feffer is the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies here in DC. He is the author of several books and numerous articles. He studied in England and Russia.
Yeah, that's true. It's not
Very
misinformation.
And has taught in Seoul, Tokyo, and in New York. And I also want to introduce Mariana Fernandez. She's our foreign policy and peace expert at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in New York and organized this event and supports us today behind the camera. But she's also an expert in our office. One word about me. Before joining the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation 2 years ago, I was a member of the German Bundestag, the German parliament, and worked there in the Foreign Affairs Committee for 12 years. Before we start, a few words about our organization, because we are not so famous, especially not so famous here in Washington, D.C. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is a political foundation, as we call it. In Germany, we have a system that every political party that is for a longer period in the German parliament gets taxpayer funding for an affiliated organization called foundation. I say this because here in the US, foundation is always mostly connected to rich people and organizations giving money. That's not the case for us. That's why I prefer to call us Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So you wouldn't know, it means foundation, but that's what we are doing. So we We are located in Germany and Europe, but we have 20 offices abroad. And with this, we are one of the biggest worldwide left organization. We are doing educational work, not only in peace and security policy, also in social rights, socio-ecological transformation, the fight against right-wing extremism. And we support global solidarity and internationalism globally. So this is where we are. The Atlas of Disarmament we are talking about today was coordinated and edited by our colleague Eva Wucholt from our Geneva office. We have here in this Atlas scholars, activists, and journalists contributing to show that there are ways to achieve a global peace through fewer, not more weapons. And we are convinced as an organization our world must move towards a system of collective security based on the principles of peaceful coexistence, confidence building, and arms control and disarmament. And I know with all the terrible wars in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Gaza, that seems very unrealistic right now, but I am old enough to remember a time when things were much better. So it was possible to sign treaties, it was possible to even destroy a whole class of weapons. In my home country, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, we have even seen a whole army disappearing. So such things are possible. So we shouldn't give up. And I look forward to hearing from Jasmine Owens about her ideas for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and then from John Feffer, who, like me, contributed to this atlas, about the change in US relations regarding China. And then I will say a few words about my text in the book. Thank you again, Emma. And
Thank you. I'm sorry.
yeah, no problem. And I would invite you to start.
Yeah, so apologies. I'm going to do the really professional thing and have my notes on my phone. But in reading this atlas, I just really kept coming back to Cameroonian historian and political theorist Achille Mbembe's article about necropolitics, in which he asserts that the ultimate expression of sovereignty is the ability to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. And kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this and then explain how it relates to the abolition of nuclear weapons and disarmament writ large. But I wanted to dive a little deeper in that a key aspect of necropolitics is Michel Foucault's concept of biopower. And biopower very much talks about the domains of life that power has kind of taken over control. And I think with the way that our society and our systems are set up, it is very difficult to find an avenue of life that is not controlled by the pursuit of power. And how that manifests with this desire and this perceived need for being able to carry out this ultimate expression of sovereignty, being able to decide who gets to live and die. We see this kind of dividing of people into groups, and that allows us to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. And there are subgroups within that, and that's when we get into these ideas of racism and of patriarchy, and deciding, who is worthy of life, who is worthy of power, who is worthy of a life worth living, and not living in these so-called death worlds that are created by our pursuits of military domination. And so I just kept coming back to this idea of necropolitics, because in reading this atlas and reading how there's so much long-term planning and thinking about all of the weapons buildups that we need to defend against these perceived threats in the future, whether it be from China, whether it be from Russia, what have you. All I see is necropolitics at the heart of all of this, at the heart of this white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system that we live under. That is very much undergirded by the mass killing of people in order to garner enough profit and power for a few. And this isn't a glitch in the system. This is a very key feature of the system. And nuclear weapons are the ultimate expression of being able to carry out this ultimate expression of sovereignty. There exists no greater killing force than the atom bomb. And therefore, there exists no greater political tool for this pursuit of absolute control over life and death. And I see it's hard not to see these arms buildups as a futile effort, but an effort nonetheless to either chase a modicum of the power and prestige that nuclear weapons can offer, that we see with their possessor states. We see how the US, how Russia, how North Korea, how Israel, how so many of these nuclear weapon states have used nuclear weapons for their own political gains, for their own ideas of how they perceive these other countries within, their own game. Or in which case, in some of these buildups are for countries who are trying to defend against these possessor states, trying to defend against again, it's a futile effort, but an effort nonetheless to defend against the unfathomable death and destruction that these weapons can cause. And so how this is manifesting, and we see this in the Atlas of Disarmament, is constant arms buildups, constant focus on military solutions to security threats, while kind of not prioritizing or giving enough attention and resources to very real actual security threats that span borders, that it doesn't matter where you are, what color your skin. We think of climate change, and we think of pandemics. These are indiscriminate transnational security threats, and military solutions are not going to help us to combat or to mitigate these actual existential crises. But the military-industrial complex is the one that is very much kind of pushing this idea that the only way that we can achieve true security, true safety, true sovereignty is through the massive buildup of weapons, and to engage in wars and to pursue not even security at this point, but total domination. And there is so much money being funneled into this enterprise, while there's pennies and very little attention paid to these other threats. And we see in the Atlas too that a lot of the sources for conflicts are not actually about the weapons themselves, but it's about insecurity. It's about having lack of resources, not having land, not having water, not having food, not having access to the resources that we need to not just survive, but to thrive. And in turn, countries and communities turn to weapons and to war to try and achieve this security, because we're told that this is the only way that we can. And so I think the Atlas really touches on this, that true security at the end of the day is never going to be achieved through weapons. It's never going to be achieved through war. And in order to actually, in my opinion, bring about disarmament, or to actually make meaningful strides in disarmament, we need a radical transformation in not just what we think of as security and safety, but in the systems that we live in, because these systems themselves prop up this notion of we need to focus on protecting our own, and we need to focus on the very violent and physical and aggressive tactics to do so, rather than cooperation and communication and transparency and confidence building and all of these other measures that are so crucial in actually achieving disarmament. And I think, looking back on some of the historical efforts to abolish nuclear weapons, I think that the Black Freedom Movement was really, they really understood this, and they very much were trying to mobilize feminist groups and labor unions and entertainers to understand that the issue of nuclear weapons is something that we all need to care about. It is something that impacts all of us. And because it intersects with imperialism, with racism, with colonialism, it is what allows these countries to pursue these oppressive efforts, because they have, how can you refute that when they have nuclear weapons? How can you defend yourself when you know that your opponent, all they have to do is send one weapon to obliterate your community? And so I think it's really approaching disarmament kind of from, I think, learning from the abolitionist movement during the Cold War, and specifically from the Black freedom movement, who was really involved in pushing this idea of nuclear abolition, pushing this idea of abolition from an intersectional standpoint and connecting it to these other systems of oppression and making it a much more tangible goal and tangible problem for folks so that they understand this is something I need to care about, this is something I need to take action on. And also then presenting ways for folks to do that. It's not just showing them that there's a problem, but also giving them agency to actually make change. And I think in order for us to really actually go beyond just these small kind of short-term efforts that don't really get us very far, I think we have to just really radically rethink how we approach disarmament. And I think with that too is like the UN can only get so far, and we need to transform the Security Council. How can we make any real progress on the abolition of nuclear weapons when the entire Security Council is all nuclear weapon states? That's just not feasible. And so I think there are ways that we can work with civil society and with organizations to, and people power to really mobilize and make progress on disarmament, because we don't have the funds like the military industrial complex does to do so, to pay these leaders to continue to build weapons. We have to really combine our forces and our efforts to kind of come up with new ways of approaching disarmament that I think we can learn a lot from previous abolition movements, specifically with nuclear weapons, to do so. So I'll stop there because that kind of got a little long-winded, and I'll let you two carry on the conversation. But thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. I would give you the opportunity, if you want to, if you have questions, remarks, you could bring it in now, or we could give the floor to John Feffer, and you give us a little insights in your thoughts that you wrote down to the Atlas, but you are not restricted to this one.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Jasmine, because, your discussion of necropolitics reminded me of when I came here to Washington, and this is really the center of necropolitics, isn't it? I didn't understand necropolitics until I came here to Washington. And I came here to Washington on a Scoville Fellowship to do arms control and disarmament. And when I came here to Washington, I discovered it wasn't arms control and disarmament. It was arms control versus disarmament.
Yeah.
That arms control was in many ways an expression of necropolitics, of trying to control futilely, whereas disarmament was really the liberation movement that we should be focusing on. But I'm not going to talk about that because you eloquently talked about that. I'm supposed to talk about China and U.S. relations with China, another version of necropolitics perhaps. And it might seem strange to talk about China at this point because we're so focused on the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And as an example of that, I brought this in. This is, of course, Bob Woodward's latest book, War. You look in the index, and there are like 5 mentions of China in here. 5. I mean, it's like, I think Ivory Coast has more mentions in this book than China does. And it's inconceivable to me that you could talk about these wars going on in Ukraine and the Middle East without talking about China. As I was reading this, it occurred to me that this was similar to, we have in English, this strange construction called you understood. When you say something like, do this, do that, the you is understood. You do this, you do that. In this book, it's China understood. In other words, everything in here can be understood as bracketed with China at the beginning of it. In other words, not only the role that China plays, but the effort by the United States and the Biden administration in particular to move away from these wars in Europe and the Middle East and focus on China. If we look at the last 30 years, we could interpret the last 30 years as this effort to drag the United States out of its traditional post-World War II focus on Europe and the Middle East and refocus on Asia. That, of course, was what Bill Clinton tried to do in the 1990s when he kind of embraced APEC and kind of said, look, the economic future for the United States is Asia, is the Pacific. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State in 2011, re-articulates this, not as the Pacific pivot, that she used a different phrase, but it came to be understood as the Pacific pivot, that the Cold War is over. We no longer need to focus on Europe. We have to move away from the George W. Bush moment of wars in the Middle East, and we have to focus on the Pacific century, and this is the future for the United States, both from a military and an economic point of view. And kind of integral to that is competition with China economically, competition with China militarily. But of course, as we know, war keeps happening. War keeps kind of anchoring the United States in its positions in Europe and in the Middle East. And we have, for instance, obviously, the war in Ukraine and the presence of about 100,000 troops in Europe, generally speaking. The war in the Middle East, the presence of about 44,000 troops. These troop levels change from week to week sometimes. But it's also in the policy. If we look at the policy of the Biden administration, we understand that understood in brackets is this desperate desire to say, for God's sakes, people, can you please stop fighting in these parts of the world so we can get on to the real business, and the real business from the Biden administration's point of view, and frankly from the Republican Party's point of view as well, is China. Focus on China. So the Biden administration doesn't go all in Ukraine. It makes very clear from day one there are not going to be boots on the ground. There are going to be restrictions on the export of US weapons to Ukraine, and there are even going to be restrictions on what Ukraine can do with those weapons when it gets them. All of these restrictions are basically, we do not want to get into a war with Russia. We do not want this conflict to escalate, and we desperately do not want to have a nuclear exchange. And there's a fascinating conversation in here about the conversation around the potential use of Russian tactical nuclear weapons as Ukraine was liberating the city of Kherson. But we see it as well in the Middle East with the Biden administration basically continually saying, we need a ceasefire, we need a ceasefire. Yeah, there are problems with the US version of that ceasefire, but it definitely reflects a genuine desire to put this war behind so that we are no longer anchored in the Middle East as we were previously. The real adversary, in other words, is China. And that you can see written across any number of US policy statements. Obviously, the national security doctrine, the national security strategy released in 2022, all about China. China, China, China. If we look at troop levels in the region, I said 100,000 in Europe, 44,000 in Middle East, 375,000 in the Pacific theater. So obviously, that's where we're putting our military focus. The increase in US military spending, all the big ticket items, China focused. I mean, we're not, putting money into destroyers for Ukraine, not doing it really to defend Israel. We have, what we consider to be sufficient firepower to support Israel. It's to go up against China. The increase of spending on Pacific affairs in the 2024 budget, an increase of 40% on just our commitment to the Pacific. It also means beefing up our allies. Tremendous increase in military bases in the northern part of Australia, for instance, to give one example. Give a second example. This just recently released. This is actually kind of mind-boggling for those of you who follow Japan. We are helping Japan turn a destroyer into its first aircraft carrier. Hasn't had aircraft carriers since World War II because it supposedly has a peace constitution. Well, it hasn't had a peace constitution in a long time. Do you want to know what the name of that aircraft carrier will be? It will be Kaga. For those of you who know World War II history, Kaga was the name of an aircraft carrier that attacked Pearl Harbor. Really? So this is an extraordinary reversal of US policy to give Japan the necessary tools to abrogate its peace constitution and to go up against China. But the other kind of consideration is defense of Taiwan and the potential, and in some circles in Washington, D.C., the certainty that China will attack Taiwan in 2027. Like, where did this number come from? Where did this date come from? Well, it's the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, but that doesn't seem kind of sufficient, to justify 2027 as the date. Apparently, Xi Jinping set 2027 as a date for a certain level of modernization of the Chinese military. That was interpreted by a number of US observers, including some very high-level military personnel, as the date that China will attack Taiwan. And so this date of 2027 is used as the justification for a number of different things. Obviously, the increase in US military spending in the region, greater arms transfers to Taiwan. The Taiwanese, not so concerned. 61% in the most recent poll say a war in the next 5 years is extremely unlikely. Now, you could look at that two ways. You could say, well, the Ukrainians were also convinced before Russia invaded that Russia was not going to invade, so perhaps the Taiwanese are as naive as the Russians, as the Ukrainians rather. Or you could say, using the Ukrainian example again, there's no way that China is going to invade Taiwan after the experience of Russia in Ukraine. You can say, well, Russia's kind of a second-rate military power. China prides itself on being a first-rate military power. But if you look at actually the difficulty of an invasion in Taiwan, the fact that the Taiwan Strait represents an extraordinary barrier that prevents any kind of major amphibious operation, as well as the mountain chain that runs right down through Taiwan, makes it extremely difficult for the Chinese army to actually seize Taiwan in any significant way. But nevertheless, 2027 is this date that has been put out there. I want to mention briefly the economic threat that China poses, according to the United States, because it does filter into our understanding of China as a threat. And the risk of decoupling, and I'll end with just a few sentences on this question of decoupling. When Donald Trump applied tariffs across the board on Chinese products during his administration, Joe Biden said, this is ridiculous. This man does not know economics. Because obviously the people who are going to pay for this are Americans, American business, American farmers, American consumers. When he gets into office, what does he do? Suspend those tariffs? No, he continues those tariffs and he adds to them. Not only does he add to the tariffs, but he adds some export restrictions as well around computer chips and other things. The economic competition between the United States and China is extraordinarily serious, extraordinarily serious. Again, looking in the long term, one could see that there is a kind of transformation, a transition away from the petrodollar as kind of the essential currency of the post-World War II era to the mineral yuan. In other words, China controls 80 to 90% of all the major critical raw materials in the world. A couple of exceptions. We have a lot of copper here. Indonesia has a lot of nickel. But nevertheless, China controls an extraordinary amount of the critical raw materials that are necessary for this energy transition we have to go through. And the United States is desperately trying to catch up, the European Union desperately trying to catch up. But hey, it's not just that China controls the extraction and processing, it also controls the intellectual property rights of how to extract this in the most efficient manner. And that is a gap that the United States and the European Union are going to have a hard time catching up on. China also has basically kind of established institutions that can replace the IMF and the World Bank if it decides at some point that it doesn't want to deal with the dollar any longer, that it wants the yuan backed by its kind of mineral hegemony, if you will, if it wants the yuan to be the kind of world currency. It says, screw it, we're no longer interested in the global economy. The US response has been, well, we're going to try our best to, develop our own capabilities. And in the meantime, we're going to decouple our economy from China's, because we are dangerously exposed. If we're going to go up against this country, but we're dependent on this country for so many critical things, well, then we're kind of screwed. We can't actually confront them militarily. So decoupling then is the solution going forward. And I'll end here with a cautionary tale about where decoupling can end, and that's North Korea. Some of you may have been following the news in North Korea. North Korea basically decided reunification with the South, no longer possible. It's taken that, or it's about to take it out of its constitution as, in other words, the peaceful reunification with the South as a goal of the North. Take it right out of the constitution. Tongil, the Korean word for reunification, has been removed from train station names. They've destroyed the peaceful reunification monument in Pyongyang. Everything that is associated with peaceful reunification, taken out. North Korea is actively decoupling its relationship across the board with South Korea. I mean, it has some active support in South Korea from conservatives, which we won't go into. But what the kind of military bottom line is that this decoupling increases exponentially the risk of war on the Korean Peninsula, including the risk of nuclear war. Because Kim Jong-un has just recently, for the second time, said, we are going to attack the South with nuclear weapons. I mean, there are conditions here, like if the South does this, the US does this, we will attack. But this is a concern. This is suddenly, again, on the table. So my hope is that we do not see a second volume of this book, that it focuses instead on China and North Korea and the wars that the United States are suddenly implicated and inextricably, it's a tough word, involved in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, John, so much. Again, are there any comments, questions here? We can all talk. Yeah.
This is just a question for someone, and I apologize if this has already been covered before I came in. I'm sorry. I'd just like to hear a little bit about, the organization of this volume and, what's in it, what choices you made, and why now, and who's it for, and what's it, and why did you do it this way? Anything you want to say about that. The second question is, I noticed there's a section on defense industry conversion, and written by, looks like, a German, and here are the German sources. I wonder if you all have any connection to the dear departed Bonn International Conversion Center, which existed in the 90s and then the early 2000s, and I think does not exist anymore, but it was this, one of the things they did was this beautiful, I would call it an atlas, an annual publication every year that looked at the progress of each country in the world toward disarmament or toward more armament, and through, about 12 different categories of, troops and so forth. I thought that was just an extraordinary work, and I just wondered if this is any kind of continuation of that work.
I think BIG might still exist, Miriam, but yeah, it's a good reference, yeah.
I will answer as far as I can answer.
They stopped doing the atlas
They stopped doing a lot of things.
because there was no progress toward disarmament after a while.
So first about this atlas, I described our organization in the beginning. So the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is working on a lot of things. And this atlas is part of a series of different atlases. Is this a plural? In German, it's Atlanten. Okay, atlases. I remember there was one atlas of enslavement. A not so much discussed topic is that we still have slavery in many parts of the world. To bring this up, we published an atlas of enslavement. There was another atlas of stateless people, so the problems of people who have no country behind them, no passport, etc. And since peace and disarmament is a big focus of our work, the headquarters decided we should do one for disarmament. It was edited and published by our colleagues in Geneva, our office in Geneva. And what we are doing here is trying to bring this atlas to this part of the world and talk to organizations, especially among our friends in the Peace and Securities Funders Group, but all other peace and disarmament organizations we know. This is why we are here. if it comes, if you ask about conversion, my perspective is, I mentioned it in the beginning when I said I grew up in the GDR. Conversion was a big thing in the 1990s there because for obvious reasons, Cold War, socialist countries have lost. There were armies really disassembled. And then this time it was really disarmament because, of course, some of the soldiers would go to the West German armed forces. But in general, the West German army was shrinking too because we had this general feeling of there will be no peace forever. I quote here a certain Joe Biden who thought after the end of the Cold War, we will now have 50 years of peace. So it didn't happen. But in this time, we had to do real conversion because there were a lot of army compartments. We had weapons, tanks. I would say not everything went well because some of the things that should have been disassembled showed up in other wars later, like some trucks in Iraq or some weapons somewhere else. But in general, I would say it's a good example of conversion. We are not living in this time right now. Regarding the organization in Bonn, I cannot answer this question, but I'm totally willing to look if there are still people working there and make contacts if you want to, because we are very active in Germany.
I just checked.
Yeah.
It still
Great.
exists.
Yeah, that's good. So maybe our Berlin colleagues work with them. I could look at it if you want me to, and I could make contacts if you want to.
That'd be
Yeah.
probably at some point.
I would say a few words about my article, which is actually the last one in this atlas, and it's about a topic that comes from your country here, but from our German and European perspective. But before I want to do this, I want to connect to John's statement with two things. One is the story you told about Korea right now. That also reminds me to a certain phase of Germany, because it was after the Second World War. You would know the story about the communists building the wall and dividing Germany, which is not wrong. But there's also a different perspective, which is the first Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, once said he would prefer to have the half German completely than the whole German just halfly. So, and that was because Joseph Stalin made a proposal and is discussed until now if it was really an honest proposal or not. But his proposal was, yeah, we can have a reunification of Germany, but it has to be a NATO-free, neutral Germany. Obviously, the West Germans and the United States didn't like it. But in this phase, East Germany, the GDR, was the country in favor of reunification. Of course, their way of reunification. So in our anthem in the GDR, they would sing Germany United Fatherland. Then time passed on. They realized it's not going to happen. So when I was born, we didn't sing the lyrics anymore. So it was like no longer Germany United Fatherland. It was socialism in the colors of the GDR or something like this. They even tried to invent our own nation, like the East German nation. Wasn't a big success, but just to mention these developments. And this brings me to your other story with the aircraft carrier Kaga that I didn't know. I mean, as you all know, there was another terrible enemy of the United States, which was Germany. And for decades now, Germany is under pressure by several US administrations. It was not only Trump. I remember when I was elected to the German Bundestag, it was Obama time. And he was, of course, not that rude, but it was the same goal. Have a bigger army, have more tanks, have your own drones. So that was what they asked us. And this is actually somehow my topic in this atlas. So I talk about Donald Trump and the NATO. And you may remember a few months ago, he said, I would not protect an ally that didn't meet the NATO spending guidelines. In fact, I would encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want. And so he publicly called into question the core component of the alliance founding document, the Article 5, which is about the promise to help each other if one NATO country would be attacked. And I have to bring in a short point here because the perspectives on NATO are very different. So here in some liberal progressive circles, the NATO is often seen, and that's not totally wrong, as an organization that promotes collaboration with Europe, showing solidarity with Europe. If you would talk to leftists in other parts of the world, and especially in Germany, they would tell you a different story. For us there, the NATO is an organization that has to be criticized. A lot of people would say the NATO has to be disassembled because of some actions against international law. If we talk about Iraq war, Afghanistan war, even Yugoslavia, you can discuss the problems in Yugoslavia, but if it comes to international law, there was a war that was not supported by the United Nations Security Council, and so on and so on. There are a million reasons to criticize the NATO, and I did this in the German parliament. But when it comes to Donald Trump, then it is more about that he doesn't like international treaties and alliances, and he wants to destroy them. And he would like to have a world where the US or he himself makes the decisions and the other just have to follow without any boundaries. And this is why I think, not because I love the NATO so much, this is why I criticize his actions in this atlas. Second thing I mentioned is burden sharing. When I was in the parliament and I met my colleagues here in the US Congress, they always talked about burden sharing. And they told a story that is also understandable. It's like, why would the US taxpayers pay for your security while you are shrinking your army and you don't have the military expenditures anymore? And it is an understandable position. And then they would say, let us share the burden. So I think this is a wrong story they tell, because burden sharing would mean if we increase in Europe our military expenditures, and we are doing it right now, then you here could be so lucky that you could decrease your military expenditures and use it for affordable housing and childcare and whatever. But this is not going to happen. So this is not burden sharing. What we are doing is an increasing of military expenditures on both sides. And this is why we shouldn't accept this word, and this is what I'm explaining in my article there. You would find a lot of more interesting articles in here. It's a very broad spectrum. I would invite you to take some printed copies. We have more there. And it is also free on our website, rosalux.nyc. So you can download it there. With this, I would ask you again if you want to discuss or question things.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. By the way, I'm Sarah Kuchesvahani. I'm Program Director at Ploughshares, so welcome to our space. I have a question for you, Jasmine. I thank you very much to all three of you for your presentations, and I'm really excited about the publication of this atlas. Jasmine, not surprisingly, I loved everything that you said, and I agreed with everything. My question, and this is not a loaded question, I'm asking it because I feel like this could generate very interesting discussion. You know, I agree with you that more needs to be done as far as kind of pushing the needle. You know, when you talked about how people have this sense of agency to kind of take action when it comes to disarmament or nuclear disarmament, I'd love to push you a little bit more and help us understand more about what does this agency look like, and what kind of, immediate next steps might you offer to people to kind of, consider taking action and really kind of feeling that sense of agency? And I'm sorry if that's it's a tough question. I know I'm asking you only because I very much struggle with answering this. So if anyone else has ideas as well, I'd love to. But if you don't mind starting, trying to answer that question, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, not a loaded question at all. I also struggle with that question. I think it's, I mean, just working within the nuclear abolition space, there's not a whole lot of, I mean, so many of the organizations within this space are very policy focused, which isn't bad because policy is how we are going to actually kind of carry out disarmament and how we actually kind of make these transformations. But we don't have the political influence to actually like implement these policies or get our leaders to do so. And there's not as much of a focus on how do we build a movement, whether that's and it doesn't have to be one large global movement for like covering every issue, because that's not feasible. I've been learning a lot from emergent strategies and how we can it's taking a lot from nature, but how can we kind of move together? How can we flock together when we think of birds? We're moving in the right direction, but we're all doing our own thing. And sometimes, people move from the back, from the front. There's movement. Different people take lead at different times. And regardless, I think there needs to be more of an emphasis on how do we like get people engaged, and then like how do we I don't have the answer of what can we offer them to do to give them agency. I think maybe the first step really is just like the knowledge of like this issue or whatever issue you're working on within disarmament or what have you, how it relates to them, giving them that groundwork of like, okay, I understand what's happening, or at least I have somewhat of a picture. And then from there, I don't think there is any one person or group that can come up with ideas of how we give people agency. I think it's something that we do all have to work through together. And I think it's how that manifests, I think depends on what actions we take, what directions we head in. So that's like a very vague answer, but like, I don't know if there is a specific answer I can give you of like, how do we give people agency? I think we have to invest more in that and like trying to figure out that question. So like taking that to the funders and to those who have the resources for folks to engage in this work, how can you support them to do so? And in a way that is thinking more long-term, because I've talked about this before with, I think that not even just in our field, but so many other fields, the way that funding is set up is very difficult for mobilizing and for long-term movement building and for mobilizing the public and trying to actually build the people power. And so I think there has to be a lot of transformations in how we fund these organizations and then how they're able to do their work. And so like, I think it's going to take every kind of facet of this field working together, in which, as we know, is very difficult. But I think that's kind of the main way that we're really going to be able to at least start to answer that question of how do we really give people agency. Yeah, and would love to hear what anyone else has to say.
May I say one word? What we try to do next year is using the anniversary that I mentioned. It is in Germany a big topic. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki thing was always a thing that people discuss, and because everyone could see the horrific effects of the use of nuclear weapons. And we tried to transform it in a debate that Germany should sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this is actually a thing that is happening. So you can see a movement there. It was, even if the members of the United Nations Security Council are all in nuclear states, there are other states who are saying, no, we don't agree. And they are collecting signatures more and more. And our government is under pressure, not enough. It's not the main topic in Germany, but we could use the next year, because we have now a minister for foreign policy from the Green Party, Annalena Baerbock. I know her forever, and there are a lot of things that I like and support. But Germany, as a country that is, we don't have nuclear weapons, but we are under the protection of the US nuclear weapons, and we are on their side by saying no. And this is not a popular position. So if you would ask people,
no one likes it. And this is our tiny thing what we can do, and we as an organization will invite a delegation from Germany, from ICANN Germany, to come to this conference, make side events, you know our business. That's how we do it. But this is a point where I try to connect and move the needle a tiny bit in the good direction. Yes, please.
Hey, Jeff Abramson, and if you can't hear me, I'll take off my mask. But
I think it's okay.
I have a sort of too many rambling thoughts, so it's cut me off when you want. But on agency, I think one of the questions is you have to have some examples of success, even if they're small. And what I'm not quite sure I'm seeing in one place is sort of the believable recommendations for the future. I think that's the challenge all of us have in the United States too, is that we want a different future, but it's hard to convince people that the path to that doesn't involve a big military. You know what I mean? It's like they feel the security concern, and they think the only answer is more weapons spending. I mean, that's a simplification, but I think our positive narrative of what's possible is harder to sell, and it's not as well organized, and I'm not even sure what it is sometimes. So I think that's a weird thing of what I was trying to find in here, which is like, what's the believable alternative? Not what's the alternative, what's the sellable, believable alternative? But I just want to start with there, and I think that, one of the things that we do, or I do, is I care about the United States export of small arms, right? These go around the world, they kill a lot of people. People in the United States don't care. But there's a huge gun violence prevention community that understands that having semi-automatic weapons in the streets matters. And there's an easy case to make that if you don't think these should be in our streets for XYZ reasons, why do you think they should be in other countries? And I think you can build that. There's some really interesting work being done right now between US and Mexico, because this problem of arms flow is really apparent in Mexico, and the migration discussion only occasionally makes the point that the reason people are fleeing from the South is partly because of the crap we're sending that way. But there are talks about trying to get black leaders in Chicago to talk about arms to Mexico. I mean, it's like there's the interesting possibilities of I think empowerment, or giving people some sense. So some other quick thoughts. So the Forum on the Arms Trade is a network of now over 175 emerging experts around the world. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung supported our emerging expert program for a couple of years, which is great. I was looking at this section right here, and I'm going to be, this is page 8 and 9, it's kind of like this 12 steps thing. Next week I'll be up at the UN. The humanitarian disarmament movement gets together every weekend around First Committee, and I wonder how many of them are aware of the publication, because I think what you've done here is, it's 2 to 3 pages on all these different issues, right, which is great. Ray Atchison is the only part of the forum that is an author here. So I was looking through the authors and why wasn't Miriam Penderton the author of Conversion? So there's a lot of people to meet, I think, for me. But I raise this in that, Reaching Critical Will, where Ray is at, does a First Committee that has a similar effort, right? All these different issues and what the advocacy community wants out of it. So I don't know how to make these connections happen better. I think there's a lot of authors here I don't know, which is great and surprising. But I also think that this page is like a history of humanitarian disarmament, and there's a number of pages of that, and I think you talk about it, but I think that's a concept where there are positive examples. That's a place where a lot of these treaties that are being talked about or agreements are talking about. So there's an honest linkage here that would make sense. The final point, I don't know whether this would make sense, but I'll just throw it out there. The forum has internal conversations where we bring people in to talk about the work they're doing. It might make sense to sort of do one on the Atlas, so maybe we should talk afterwards about that.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people would show up, so it may or may not be worthwhile, but long ramble, thanks a bunch for listening to that, and I think if we can think of the positive alternative solution that's sellable That's maybe my main point.
I'm happy to turn this into a conversation, so yeah, please.
Sure. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm Julia Gledhill. I'm at the Stimson Center, a think tank just around the corner, in a new program called National Security Reform, where we focus mainly on trying to cut the Pentagon budget drastically, mainly through looking at weapon acquisition and military contracting. So rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, but also, acquiring fewer weapons. So, nuclear work is obviously an integral part of that, and really appreciate y'all's insights, and I'm excited to dig into the Atlas. I have a question for John on China. So I am a voyeur in the nuclear field and have been, trying to learn a lot more in the last few months. And I didn't realize the true scope of disarmament that happened, actually at the end of the Cold War, where we did reduce our arsenal pretty drastically. And there was a lot of, collaboration with the former Soviet Union. And, it seems to me like we have the national security establishment in DC invoking, the end of World War II, the Cold War, to then justify what some call strategic competition, what others call a Cold War. Do you see opportunity now with China to, kind of pursue the type of disarmament and collaboration that happened with Russia at the end of the Cold War? Do we have to have a hot war before that happens? I'm just curious how you think about that.
I would suggest we take another remark. I would say something to you, and then maybe, John, you can answer to Julia.
Hello, I'm Nomsa Ndongwe. I'm at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and we matriculated together in Monterey. Monterey Mafia is heavily represented in the room, as always, when it comes to this topic. I want to say thank you so much to all of the speakers. I loved everything you had to say. I actually grew up behind the Iron Curtain in Romania, so I remember Checkpoint Charlie when it was manned. Well, it was always men, so I think it's an apt description there. My question is for John as well, and I love the fact that you mentioned how being in DC is like being at the heart of what is it, necropolitics? I was going to say necropolis, and I was like, no, basically, not a fancy novel. Sorry, necropolitics. But I wanted to ask, when you were referring to the book, you referred to how there's. I wasn't quite clear whether it was your opinion or the author's opinion about how the U.S. is finding itself involved in the Middle East, and I wanted to push back on that characterization that the U.S. has full agency in whatever it's involved in the Middle East. So when we say, oh, we want to pivot to China, right? I guess I'm using we as when in Rome. I did just wanted to ask for clarification on that part, because, and very much like our colleague here said, does it have to be a conflict? Because it does sound like whether or not that is China's intentions, this is what's going to happen. There's a building sense of inevitability about it, and I'm very curious to hear your perspectives, because I am not a China expert.
Yeah, please.
Since we're on the topic of China, I'm also very interested about opportunities for cooperation for threat reduction and arms control with China, especially because China is the one nuclear possessing state that has a no first use policy. And at the UNGA, they've actually proposed a resolution for all the other nuclear weapon possessing states to join in on shifting from using, to declaring basically that the possession of nuclear weapons is for deterrence only, and that no one would be the first country to engage in nuclear war. So just like how, I guess like I'm trying to take little pieces from conversations. How do we build support for that, and what are some forces that resist against, this step-by-step movement toward disarmament, the first step of which would be just declaring that these weapons are not for offensive use?
Okay, please.
Sure, I can add another question to the pile.
Is it for John too?
Well, this
Got a
would
good
actually be for Jasmine, so maybe we
Jasmine.
can like break it up a little bit. But kind of following on several threads that have been discussed so far, and for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Sophia Poteet. I'm also with the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. And when I was looking through this, I turned first to the section on gender and feminist action because that relates to a lot of the work that I do as well. And was reading this, and I noted one line that today feminists are trying to increase the diversity of those involved in disarmament, and they are challenging the patriarchal systems of power that perpetuate militarism. Speaking of those systems, I think that relates to a lot of what you were talking about, Jasmine. And I completely agree with this, although I also think challenging the patriarchal systems of power is a complex and difficult and ongoing effort, and really relates to what we were talking about, like, okay, what are the concrete steps? It's not simple. And so, Jasmine, I'm curious in your work, like looking either at the Black Power movement or Black Freedom movement, or like history of feminist action on disarmament, like the Grand and Common Women's Peace Camp, are there, we talk about these like cases, like use cases towards disarmament that you look at that you see as potentially like replicable or at least relevant to reference in disarmament today? And I'll say before I close up, the one that comes to mind for me is there was an interesting article by a Swedish scholar on disarmament, Emma Rosenberg, I think is her name, where she was looking at the case of Sweden in the 1950s and 1960s when they were trying to consider, do we go for nuclear weapons or not? 'Cause this was a real conversation, debate happening. And she was analyzing this through a gender lens and was looking at how the discussion in Sweden actually sort of shifted what we might think of as sort of like traditional ideas of the connections between masculinity and armament. Normally we think about those as, you know, armament is seen as this like masculine trait and you have to be a real man and have armament. But actually the conversation in Sweden, masculinity was portrayed as disarmament, and disarmament was seen to be this rational, responsible, reasonable thing to do, or rather than disarmament, more the decision not to pursue nuclear weapons. And so that's always an interesting case for me to refer back to when we think about challenging patriarchal systems of power in relation to disarmament, and like how we can actually, this is an actual example of a different sort of gendered idea about disarmament that then had an impact on a state's decision to pursue it. So just would leave that there, and I'm really interested in any like cases that you think back to.
Okay, thank you for all your questions and remarks. I would say I give a short, maybe not short, I give an answer to you. I would invite Jasmine to answer, and then John. And then we have to wrap it up because I don't want to exploit our hosts here. So, the easy thing is we are here now as an organization. I mean, we are not here in Washington, D.C., unfortunately. All the other political foundations are here. We are based in New York, but that's not a problem because we have a beautiful train connection. So feel free to ask me for make any connections you want. We have room for improvement and we can do a lot. We are, as I mentioned, we have 20 offices abroad. We have some challenges because our funding is connected to the success of the Left Party in Germany, which is not a success story right now, but we are there and we can make connections, and I'm happy to help with this. Second thing, are there alternatives? And it sounds weird, but I have to say a few words about it. On page 14, you find the OSCE story. And if I talk to my American colleagues in the Congress and I mention the OSCE, then they start to talk, and after a few seconds I realize they talk about the OECD, not the OSCE, because the OSCE is unfortunately not so famous, and this is why I want to talk about it a bit more. When we were in the middle of the Cold War and everything was terrible, it was possible to have an agreement between East and West. And I think Erich Honecker, the former communist leader of the GDR, got his most famous picture. So he was sitting, because of the alphabet, there was Gerald Ford, Erich Honecker, Helmut Schmidt, who was the West German chancellor. And it was a big thing. So we had head of states from socialist countries and Western countries, plus USA and Canada. So it was not just European, it was always with the USA and Canada. And the deal they made was, you in the East, you communist countries, you have to take care of human rights and such things. But on the other hand, we are open as Western countries to have a talk about
peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence in that time was seen by Western countries as a socialist thing. So actually, I still think it is a good thing. I mean, I don't like the system in China. I'm in favor of a democratic system. But it's not me to change this. And as long as they live in their system, and we have to solve problems together as the obvious climate change. I mean, I don't like the system in the United Arab Emirates either. It's a monarchy, and I don't like it. So, and I hope it will be changed, but that is not my role. And until then, we have to find a system of somehow trust, treaties, peaceful coexistence. And this happened. They made treaties, they controlled each other. And of course there were some setbacks. When the Soviet Union then invaded Afghanistan, there was a discussion, should we end this whole thing? We cannot trust them. And the other side did terrible things too. But it existed until the 1990s. And why do I think it was an alternative and maybe can be an alternative again? In the 1990s, the Warsaw Treaty, the socialist NATO opposite alliance, Warsaw Pact was disassembled, and that would have been a great moment to do the same with the NATO and form a European security organization, because I'm not a person who thinks we shouldn't have these organizations. I have people in my left world, and even in my party, the left party in Germany, who would say, just let Germany leave the NATO. I think that's wrong. We should be in a common security alliance, but it should be a different one. And this one, there was a meeting in Paris, December 1990, where they had a beautiful declaration. From now on, we will organize peace and security on our continent together. Didn't happen. So, and this is why the OSCE still exists. It's complicated to work there. I was in the Parliamentary Assembly, and it's not easy to come to an agreement with a colleague from Belarus, because they have different opinions. So, but still, trying to work in this inclusive organizations, I'm totally convinced, brings more security than increase the weapon arsenals on both sides. Yes, it is complicated because we do have an aggressive neighbor who is invading countries. And of course, people are afraid. And my family lives in Germany and they are afraid. So then it's easier to sell more armament instead of disarmament. But it's not that there are no alternatives. And this is why I like to talk about this organization so much. Maybe we need a new one. But what we need is an inclusive organization that is based on the things you can agree on. And it will not be everything, but it will be enough to have a more peaceful world. Jasmine.
Yeah, I've been thinking about your question, and my kind of research hasn't been as much in specifically the feminist aspect of disarmament, more so as it pertains to race. But I want to touch back on the 1982 disarmament rally, and like that, the largest disarmament rally in the U.S. history, with over 1 million people who attended, and that was fully like that wouldn't have happened without the collaboration with the Black freedom movements, the civil rights movement in the U.S., because there were leaders like Paul Robeson and Harry Belafonte and Coretta Scott King who were mobilizing other sectors of the U.S. population and actually the global population. They were traveling around the world to mobilize people. But it was connecting to these issues with Coretta Scott King, connecting to the issue of feminism as it relates to nuclear weapons, and Paul Robeson as it relates to labor and nuclear weapons, and Harry Belafonte as it pertains to the role of entertainers in kind of being voices for the future. And I think all of that was really influential in mobilizing the people and getting them to realize that this was something that impacted them, and that they needed and could take action on. And for them, that agency was going to the rally. And I forget who it was in the Reagan administration, but they had mentioned that rally was influential in paving the way for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. that eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons. And so I think that is a huge success story and shows how when we do talk about nuclear weapons in these broader contexts as it relates to feminism or race or capitalism or what have you, that we can make those strides and that we can actually have influence, because that was such an influential treaty that really, as Julie was talking about, like really helped to kind of really start this disarmament effort during the Cold War and after. And so I think it's just an interesting and hopeful story of success that like it is possible when we do actually like make these connections and again like provide the agency for people to showcase that they don't support these weapons, that they want them gone, that it can actually influence policymakers. Because then Reagan was kind of forced to have to like go to the table and talk with Gorbachev and try and figure out how we can move forward. Obviously, we didn't get that much further in eliminating other kinds of weapons, and now we're seeing buildups again. But I don't know. I look to that story as like hope for the future and how we can like actually make progress on nuclear disarmament.
That's fascinating. I didn't know the connection between the rally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine. John?
So lots of great questions. Middle East, I'll start with Middle East. Look, the United States, as we all know, is a hegemonic power. It believes it should be everywhere, you know. It's not going to pull out of the Middle East. It wants to reorient itself, literally reorient itself to the Pacific region. What has it done toward that? Well, I mean, obviously it's ended, quote unquote, U.S. Engagement in the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq. Obviously, there's still U.S. Presence of U.S. Military personnel in Iraq, in Syria, but those wars have effectively ended in terms of U.S. involvement. More importantly, perhaps, energy independence. I mean, we no longer are dependent on the Middle East for our energy needs. And that was the cornerstone of U.S. involvement in the Middle East since World War II and FDR's meeting with King Saud. So it's always been about kind of burden sharing, you know, getting our European allies to take on the responsibilities as we continue to spend more money on our military, but getting them to spend more money so we don't have to pay as much attention to European affairs, perhaps as we did before, and hedging our bets in the Middle East, getting a nuclear agreement with Iran, for instance, trying to get all of the Arab countries to recognize Israel in the Abrahamic Accords. So a variety of different strategies to diminish our footprint in some small way, but of course, continuing to have some hegemonic influence in the region. For China, I mean, China's a fascinating topic when it comes to nuclear issues because it, in some ways, has been our greatest ally. You know, when we were negotiating with North Korea on non-proliferation, we relied heavily on China because China was like, damn, we don't want a nuclear power on our border, especially a crazy leadership with nuclear weapons. And China had its experience with crazy leadership during the Cultural Revolution, when its own nuclear complex was under threat by Red Guards who were going to take it over. 16-year-olds who were going to get control of the nuclear codes. The Chinese leadership knows that that's not a good idea. So we worked with them very closely on North Korea. Russia, the Biden administration, when there was the prospect of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons, when Ukraine was in its counteroffensive and heading toward Kherson, about to take over Kherson, and the Russians were like, you do that, we're gonna use tactical nuclear. We're not gonna tell you how, we're not gonna tell you when. And we reached out to China, and Xi Jinping came out with a strong statement, public statement, against the use of nuclear weapons, as if people needed a reminder. But anyway, that was a strong statement to Russia, its ally, that you better not do that or you're going to sever relationship with us. So China has been a strong ally on this question of especially nuclear proliferation, but also the conduct of nuclear powers. When it comes to its own nuclear arsenal, however, China's always been like, you folks have lots of nuclear weapons and we don't. We're modernizing. but we're not going to be at the table for reductions because we don't have enough to qualify for reductions. I actually was in a meeting in China in Beijing in the spring with the kind of arms control and disarmament folks, and we brought a proposal, about, well, would you consider like reductions of military spending around nuclear weapons, perhaps for use of money elsewhere in the region for climate purposes in conjunction with the United States and other powers? And they were like, it's okay. No, our nuclear weapons are basically, it's sufficient deterrent force, we're modernizing them, but we're not going to be part of the same kind of negotiations that you had during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, for instance. That, of course, doesn't preclude other possibilities around no first use, about China's, the big thing China's considering is possibly being a party to the Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone. That's on the horizon. So there are these kind of partial arms control things that are on the horizon. But what I think is critical, and I'll say just two things, one about the OSCE and one about the inevitability of conflict with China. One of the key lessons for the OSCE, actually from the CSC, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, its predecessor, is the importance of delinking issues. Now, we all know that there were 3 baskets in the CSCE of issues that folks were dealing with, but the critical question was, can we address, for instance, nuclear issues separate from human rights issues? And the clear lesson coming out of the CSCE is, yeah, you better, or else you're not going to get progress in either area. So if we're looking for concrete progress on nuclear issues, we have to do it in a delinked fashion. In other words, right now it's not really a possibility, but when talking with Russia, it's like, yeah, obviously we disagree about Ukraine, but we can agree about nuclear weapons. Let's have some delinked conversations. Not going to happen anytime soon with Russia, but it certainly can happen with China, especially as they're modernizing their. By the way, the expectation is in about maybe 10 years, China will have a sufficient arsenal to then be at the table. So, of course, it makes some sense to have some of these conversations now and postpone what many people consider to be the inevitable, which leads me to the last point, the question of inevitable conflict between the United States and China. I think, obviously, for a lot of reasons I already mentioned, but there are any number of opportunities for cooperation. Obviously, I mentioned the ones around the nuclear question specifically. Middle East peace, China was very responsible for the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So China now has a concrete role in the Middle East. We're talking about a ceasefire there. US and China are going to be at the table. If we can have any resurrection of the Iran nuclear agreement, and I'm pessimistic and lots of people are, but China's going to be at the table for that. But the real issue for me, and this gets to the question of what concrete things can people do on this question of abolition, I think so often we focus on the weapons themselves and what we can do about taking the weapons off the table without thinking about, well, how do we ensure that the weapons that are on the table are not used, first and foremost, and then secondly, the relationships that we build to ensure that there's sufficient trust to start taking the weapons off the table. And I always made reference to the US-China relationship with respect to North Korea on that issue. People would always be saying, we gotta get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, its nuclear potential. I said, yeah, you can try that, but North Korea sees this as an existential issue. It sees no other alternative but to have a deterrence. So you can say anything you want about the evils of nuclear weapons or the sanctions you're going to apply, and North Korea is going to still say this is an existential issue. If we look at the US-China relationship, we didn't care that China, I mean, we cared, but we didn't really fundamentally try to get China to give up its small deterrent nuclear force. Instead, we built a relationship with China, an economic relationship, a political relationship that ensured that it would be crazy for China to even think about using nuclear weapons against an economic partner, or that would destroy the relationship with the United States. So from my point of view, that should have been the focus of US-North Korean relations, not so single-mindedly focused on their nuclear deterrent, but focused on building a relationship such that North Korea would not think of using its nuclear weapons. As the relationship with China deteriorates, I think we have to again say, this is what's critical to ensure that we do not enter into, in 10 years or between now and 10 years, any kind of major conflict with China. We have to prioritize, if not an economic relationship in this era of decoupling, then a series of other diplomatic and political relationships with China. The key one, this is one everyone talks about, and I'll end here, climate. I mean, there's obviously any number of points of cooperation between the United States and China. Now, China might say, well, if you really thought that, then why'd you put a 100% tariff on our electric cars? If you really want cooperation, why'd you do such a stupid-ass thing? And I would say, you're right. We did a stupid-ass thing. But okay, let's say next administration comes to its senses and realizes, okay, there are some short-term economic problems with importing Chinese EVs, potentially for our car industry, but what should trump that is building the relationship with China on climate issues. Has to be number one. And that, for me, is something concrete that we can do as individuals, because it's not just governments and it's not just companies, it's us too working on climate issues that can be a concrete abolition-friendly move.
With that, I will end our event here. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you to Mariana organizing all the things. Thank you for your interest. Please take some of the copies with you. If you don't already sign our list, it would be nice to sign into our list. And if you need contacts to international activists somewhere, feel free to reach out to us, rosalux.nyc. That's where you find us. So thank you again and have a beautiful day.
Thank you.